In this segment, we're going to be talking about web services again, and this time dealing with a parameterized query. Many times, in order for the server to know what type of response you want, you've got to provide some information to the server itself. In this case, we're going to be working in another lottery example. This particular lottery example requires that the server find out how many random numbers you want and the maximum value of those random numbers. I've gone ahead and modified our backend server PHP program to look like this. So now what happens is the server takes in two values. These are the parameters I've been discussing. The first value is labeled as num in the request, and that's the number of numbers that are desired. Some lotteries have 3 numbers, some have 4, 5, 6, etc. The maximum value is the maximum value of any one of those numbers. Sometimes they go up to 30 or 32 or 40. So once that information is passed in, it goes ahead and echoes back all of the values to the requester. In this case, that'll be our mobile application that'll request the information. So I've got this up on a server temporarily where we're going to be able to make the request. So that's what the back end looks like. I've also already created a GUI and a basic framework for our application. The GUI includes a label asking for the number of numbers, an input where the user can type a value, hopefully between 0 and 99, labeled num, and then a max value, hopefully between 0 and 99, labeled max value. Then there's a button that the user will push, and that'll be the key to starting our AJAX interaction and interacting with our web service itself. So I want to bring up real quickly again the server side. And notice here that the request values, let me get this so we can see it. Here, num and max value will be coming in from these two inputs. And it's not these IDs that create the labels, but the query string that we're going to create here in just a minute. So I've already got our onload function, and our onload function is waiting for device ready and then calling init. Before we do anything else, I'm going to create a global XML Http variable. Of course, it has to be global because it needs to have scope in several of the functions we're going to be working with. So now in init, the first thing I'm going to want to do is hook up a listener to our button here, our button called btn_getNumbers, and have that call a function which we'll call getData, which will start the AJAX interaction. So let's get the button called button getNumbers. I used a capital U there. Let me correct that in both places. Would have worked, but just looks neater. And we're going to, of course, use the addEventListener method. First argument is the event we're listening for, which is a click. The second argument is the callback function. So let's go ahead and call it getData, as I mentioned a moment ago. Third argument will be false. So that's the first part of the init we need to do. The second part is we need to initialize our XML HTTP request variable. So XML HTTP equals new XML HTTP request, just like that. Not a bad idea at this point to also declare our callback function, the function that's going to be run when the ready state changes. So there's an event for that off of XML HTTP. We're going to call onReadyStateChange, and the function we're going to call is processReturn. You can call it, of course, anything you want. I use processReturn because I'm just in the habit of doing so, and that makes sense to me. All right, so then we're going to have our two additional functions. The getData function, which of course is called when the button is pushed. Let's make that consistent here and add our parentheses. Red lines go away like that. And the second function is the processReturn function I just mentioned. And of course, that'll be run when we have a return value from the server. So we're going to work in getData first. Here in getData, the first thing I'm going to do is build the URL where our server is located. Now I've got to build that, and I'm going to include the query string. That's the string that has our max number of numbers and our max value of each number information embedded. So here's how we do it. First of all, I'll do the base URL. And in this case, it's going to be this server right here. I'm working off a temporary server, so it may look like kind of an odd URL. So there's the folder HTML5 mobile course. I want to take the time to make sure this is right. Lottery.php. Not a bad idea to test this in your browser as you're developing, just to eliminate one possible source of the error. And actually, let's go ahead and now we're going to append the query string. So the query string starts with a question mark. So there's our question mark, and the first parameter is num. And our num equals, and now we need to get the value from the user interface, the value that the user typed in right here. So the ID of this guy is called num. So we're going to use document getElementById num dot value. Very important to have the dot value there. If you don't have the dot value, your getElementById method is actually getting the element itself. The element being, in this case, the input tag and everything that goes with it. We only want the value inside the input, so we use the dot value property. And then we need to add the second parameter. So our parameters are separated by an ampersand, and they're always separated by an ampersand whether you have 2 or you have 20. So the max equals, and then we're going to use document getElementById, and if we look down here, this second element is called max value. So that time I didn't keep the names consistent, but it doesn't matter. Now, I know I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but let's make this point one more time. Now notice that here, inside the URL string, the query string part of it that we're building, these labels here, num and max, match what's being expected by our server, num and max. That's very, very important, because otherwise this won't work. In fact, let's just run a quick test right now. I'm going to copy this. Use my copy command. Let's open one of our browsers, because this should be live, and then let's go to this URL, add the query string by hand, and make sure we get what we're expecting. So there's our URL, question mark, num equals, let's say we want 3, ampersand max equals, let's say a value of 32. All right, so we got exactly what we're expecting. That's very good news. That means at least locally here on our development machine, I'm able to contact the server, the web service, and get the values that I expect. So my parameters look correct, and they also look correct here, assuming I didn't make any type of typo or error. So now that we've got the URL, now we can work with our XML Http object, and we can use open. We're going to use get as the method, and the URL variable is the URL. And the third argument here, we'll go ahead and make false, since nothing in this program can happen until we get those values back. So essentially, I'm using this synchronously instead of asynchronously this time. And now, XML Http.send. We use the send method. That actually sends the information to the server. So the server will get the information and the query string. So we already said that process return is the callback or delegate function, and that's the function that's going to run when we get data back from the server, or at least a state change. So remember, we've got to monitor that state, and we're going to say if XML HTTP.readyState is 4, or that XML HTTP, excuse me, and not or, XML HTTP.status is 200. That's what we're looking for. Meaning 4, we've returned data, and 200, we got an HTTP OK, so we know we got at least the right data back. So when we get that, we're going to use document, get element by ID, and I created an ID, at least I think I did. I didn't create the ID. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a div ID equals result. So this is where we're going to hold the result when it comes back. So I'm calling it here, and we're going to set the inner HTML property to XML HTTP.response text. All right, so that's everything we need. We've got our initial onload function, which attaches the device ready to the document and calls init when the device is ready. Now when the device is ready, we add the listener to the button, which calls getData. Also, by way of initialization, we initialize the XML HTTP request object, and we set the onReadyStateChange delegate to process return. The getData function, we establish the URL, we make the query string and append that to the URL right here by getting the values out of the user interface. We then open our connection, send the data, and we wait for a return. When we get a return, we set the inner HTML of the result div, which is sitting down here on line 68 waiting, to XML HTTP.response text. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and try this in our actual Apple environment. So we can minimize this. I can open the folder for the application. And I'm going to open the Xcode project file. That'll both load our environment and our project. There's our environment with our project in it. And there's one more thing I've got to do in the iOS environment before this will work. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm looking for Cordova.plist. That's a property list file. And you can see here, this is actually an XML. We could look at the XML if we wanted to, but I prefer to do it here through the GUI. Here there's an array of external hosts. So here we can set the external hosts that are permissible to be used with this application. So for example, what hosts can be reached. So let's go ahead and grab our host from the data here. And all we want is this part. Now, if you access this via secure socket layer, HTTPS, you need to have that prefix as well. We're just going to do that. And now we're going to save our plist file. And we're going to close our plist. So in the Cordova.plist, we've included, oops, I just closed the whole project, didn't I? We've included in our plist the actual URL or domain that it's permissible for it to reach right there. All right, so now I'll close our plist file. There we go. And let's go ahead and try and build and run our application. So we'll click Run, and that'll build in, this time, the iPad simulator. That's what I had set. So we'll just wait for a moment for that to load. OK, there we go. And you can just see the top portion of the iPad simulator. That's OK. So for the number of numbers, let's say we want 3. And the max value, let's say, is going to be 32. We'll click Get Lottery Numbers. And there we get our values back from the server. 15, 23, 18. We get 29, 16, 13. 13, 31, 7. So now we've been able to send a parameterized query to a server, get a return,